Hey gamers, Treantmonk here. So, last couple videos on wizards we talked about tactics. Tactics for low-level wizards and then tactics for mid-level wizards. Now what we discovered when we looked at low-level wizards is we can be reasonably effective in little short spurts. But those are very limited in how often we can do them. And then the rest of the time we're just kind of supporting. And then what we found with mid-level wizards is now wizards can be pretty effective all the time. We can affect lots of enemies, we can do damage, we can control the battlefield, we can debuff our enemies, we can essentially divide and conquer our enemies so they're doing minuscule damage to our allies while we clean them up. And then we can eventually even avoid saving throws with things like Wall of Force. So today, let's talk about the Archmages. These are the high-level wizards, levels 11 and up. And this one is going to be a reasonably quick video because I really just want to give some examples on how the wizards can break the game. And mostly we're talking about spells here. And we're going to go into spell details as we go through our level guides for spells. But for now, all I want to do is just give you some highlights of the things wizards can do at those super high levels that really just kind of break the game in some cases. In other cases, just are super effective. So welcome to Treantmonk's Guide to Wizards. So there's a couple little categories I want to talk about before we start talking about actual spells and the various levels. The first thing I want to talk about is counterspell. So we obviously have counterspell, we're going to be using counterspell, but we also are a potential target for counterspell, and that can be a problem for us. It is important to remember that if you're facing somebody you think might have counterspell, there are some ways you can use to avoid that counterspell without having to worry about casting counterspell yourself. And the first is range. Counterspell has a range of 50 feet, and you can't move as part of your reaction. So as long as you are out of 55-foot range when you cast your spell, then they can't counterspell it. And then always after you cast your spell, you can move back in so you can counterspell them. Unless they, of course, use the same tactic on you, which they might if they're smart. The other possibility is line of sight. If you can remove line of sight, you prevent counterspell. And that can be done two ways. The first is maybe you hide, and then the second is maybe you have an angle where you can cast a spell at one creature while the other creature that has counterspell is blocked from you. It might be like going around a corner so that you can have line of sight on one creature but not on the enemy spellcaster who might counterspell you. But these are tactics you should think about in combat, and you need to think about them more at the high levels because counterspell is going to become more common. It's not just a tool for the PCs, it's also a tool for your enemies. So it's important to think about how you're going to avoid it. And there's a couple methods you can use, and it's just something to think about in combat, or it's going to end up surprising you. And I talked about this a little bit in the mid-level wizard tactics, but more and more we're going to have to think about how we're going to deal with legendary resistances. Because legendary resistances really start to come into play around CR10, and then they become more and more common as we go up. And at those low levels, and especially at those mid levels, we might have a big bad guy who happen to have legendary resistances. Now we're going to find that even non-main villains are going to start having legendary resistances. So we are going to be facing them more and more. And if we're relying on spells that are going to provide saving throws, then we're going to find that those legendary resistances are just going to shut us right down. And that's a problem. Now we saw how Wall of Force could work around legendary resistances. There's going to be other spells too, very similar to Wall of Force, that can also work around legendary resistances. It's important to make sure that those spells are on your tool belt so that when you face creatures that you suspect have legendary resistances, you can simply avoid them. Avoiding legendary resistances is always going to be better than burning through them. And finally, I just can't overstate the value of non-concentration spells at these levels. We're going to start to see more non-concentration spells that have bigger effects. And those are the spells that I am now very biased in favor of. The more I play, the more experience I've gained, the more I realize that value of spells that don't require concentration is so huge. We really have to be biased towards those spells. I used to love spells like Globe of Invulnerability because I figured it blocks so many spells. but the fact that it uses your concentration is just problematic because then there's so much less we can do. When we can find spells that don't use our concentration, I tend now to gobble those up. So when we were talking about low-level wizards, we were talking about big gun spells. These were the spells that we could do that had a significant impact on a combat. Might be something like a web, might be something like even a sleep spell if we're super low level. Then when we got into our mid-levels, we started talking about showstoppers. These are spells that actually totally change the outcome of a combat. When we do something like a hypnotic pattern and we just completely incapacitate half the enemy for a minute, they don't get any additional saving throws, or something like a sleet storm where they're going to start trickling through, so we're facing them off in smaller numbers, so they're doing less damage to our party all the time, even though we're doing our full damage to them. We can find a whole bunch of different ways we can just win fights, and usually take the damage down to low levels. But here, at 11th level and higher, let's talk about game changers. These are the spells that are absolutely going to change how the game is played. So let's look at 11th and 12th level. So now we're talking about the emergence of 6th level spells. Now, generally, I find that 3rd, 4th, and 5th level spells, these are the levels where I get a lot of stuff that really excites me. Not as much at 6th level, but there are some spells that do change the game. The first one is Contingency. So Contingency is a spell you're going to be casting when you're not adventuring. It's an in-between adventures kind of spell. It has a 10-day duration, and it has to be a spell that targets you, of 5th level or lower. And there's really 2 spells I hear talked about the most. Generally, we tend to be talking about defensive spells, because since it's only targeting us, we probably want something that, should we be in trouble, is going to take effect and help save us. And often I see Contingency paired with Autoluke's Resilient Sphere, so that maybe when you've taken a certain amount of damage, the sphere occurs around you, protecting you. And then sometimes I hear about Dimension Door. So sometimes when you take a lot of damage, then you can just escape. Now, there's certain advantages and disadvantages to each of these. The first thing we need to talk about is triggers, because there needs to be a trigger set that makes this spell go off. Now, we could have it something like a command word that maybe we could do just as a free action, but then we really could only use it on our turn. That might be okay. But the thing is if things happen in between your turn and your next turn that you weren't foreseeing, there's no way for you to trigger it. The other trigger I hear about a lot, and the one I tend to use the most, is a certain hit point threshold. So I'll pick a hit point threshold, and should I take damage to the point where I fall below the hit point threshold, then the spell will take effect. And you kind of have to guess on there. I tend to go for something like 1/3 of my total hit points, but there's some guesswork involved. So which one do I use, Dimension Door or Autoluke's Resilient Sphere? Well, I tend to go towards Dimension Door, and let me explain why. Autoluke's Resilient Sphere has some great advantages. First off, because you are going to be remaining in the combat, you can still drop that Autoluke's Resilient Sphere later and still be involved. You're still right in the action, you just can't be hurt. The other nice thing about it is it just stops everything. A Dimension Door, they could potentially follow you and still attack you, or depending on the size of the battle, it might not be enough to get you out. Well, an Autoluke's Resilient Sphere is just going to protect you. The reason I tend to go for Dimension Door instead is because of concentration. So sometimes I'm concentrating on a powerful or important spell, take some damage, hopefully I make my concentration save, and now my contingency is going to go off. Do I want it to bring up a spell that's going to now require my concentration? Probably not. I probably want to maintain that concentration. Dimension Door will allow me to use the Dimension Door to get out of harm's way, and I can maintain that concentration even from a long distance away, which will often have a significant impact on the combat. So that's why I tend to go for Dimension Door over Autoluke's Resilient Sphere. Now, talking about teleportation spells, another spell I find really changes the game is Scatter. So Scatter is like a mass teleport for your party. You can teleport people all over the place, all over the battlefield, not just yourself, not just your party, but also your enemies. So you can make sure that the tough enemies are always up next to your big tank character. You can make sure that your more vulnerable characters, including maybe yourself, are far away. So just think about a game of chess. If you could reposition all the pieces on the board, how big a deal is that? That's what Scatter does. And the final spell I want to talk about using level 6 spells is Mass Suggestion. And if you've watched my videos and you've watched my build videos, you'll see that whenever I get to this level, Mass Suggestion I just immediately gravitate to. And if I don't take Mass Suggestion, I usually tell you I normally take Mass Suggestion. I'm just tired of taking it all the time because it's so good. So what Mass Suggestion does is it does a suggestion spell, like the second level spell, to a group of enemies. But unlike Suggestion, it's not going to use your concentration. So we can do mass effect, no friendly fire, no concentration. That's just insanely good. So what can we suggest to our enemies? Well, that depends on DM interpretation. A suggestion spell should be a reasonable suggestion. So what's a reasonable suggestion? And it depends on your DM. So let me give you 3 examples of things I might suggest based on the kind of DM I have. So if I have a DM who has a very liberal interpretation of what they consider to be a reasonable suggestion, I might go to a group of enemies, maybe it's 10 enemies, and I'll say, join our side and turn on your allies. And then they all get a saving throw, and presumably about half of them are going to turn on their allies. And then they essentially are defeating themselves, and we're just going to mop up. Now, I totally understand if a DM figures that's not necessarily a reasonable suggestion. So then what would I do with a DM that's more in the neutral area as far as interpretation goes? Well, then I might say something like, you seem like powerful fighters, and I will reward you handsomely if we might hire you as mercenaries. So that is more reasonable to me because now we've promised a reward, and it just seems more likely that an enemy might consider that a reasonable suggestion. And I think most DMs would consider that a more reasonable suggestion. Now there's going to be some DMs that are just going to be dead set against the enemy's actually joining your side. So then what would I suggest if I have a DM like that? Well, then what I would probably say is, flee for your lives. We will spare all those who run away. Now that, I think it's really hard for DM to say that that's not a reasonable suggestion, considering that we're probably going to be winning the fight regardless, and probably most of the enemies are going to be killed. So that seems like a super reasonable suggestion. And then they get their saving throws, and then about half the enemies are just going to run away. And Mass Suggestion lasts for 24 hours. So these creatures are not coming back later on either. So we can see right at 11th level, we're getting some stuff that's really changing the game. But if we want to break the game, then we need to get to level 13. Because level 13, now things just start to break. So the first spell I want to talk about is Force Cage. So Force Cage is kind of like the evolution of Wall of Force. Now, Wall of Force apparently wasn't good enough. We're going to make it so much better. So what a Force Cage, it's like a Wall of Force, but no concentration. So that means that there's no way to target the wizard to try to bring down the Force Cage. The Force Cage is just going to stay there. The second thing is that the Force Cage is cubical instead of spherical, and it should be able to encase a gargantuan creature. So now, yes, you can encase a Tarrasque without a saving throw. So much for the legendary resistances, so much for their 600 plus hit points. You've now completely trapped them. There's no way for them to get out. Now you can make a smaller size that is completely solid or a larger size that has bars. And there's been lots of debate at my table over what kind of attacks you could do against a creature within a Force Cage if it has the bars. I don't see things like swords going through those spaces very easily. I don't even see being able to shoot arrows through there very easily. But something like, say, a moonbeam should be just fine. You could set it up and just let it burn away and eventually kill the thing inside. Or any other static effects like Cloud of Daggers. These all could probably kill a creature within a Force Cage. Now, it might take a long time because some of these creatures are going to have a ton of hit points, but they're not going anywhere. And as long as you take yourself out of range of any of their attacks possible, I mean, we have taken out ancient dragons using this method. And when I say we took out ancient dragons using this method, I mean we won initiative on round 1. Battle's over. That's it. Battle's over. That's game breaking, right? Because ancient dragons, we're talking 20 plus CR. 13th level characters can take them out, no saving throw, automatically. And of course, I have to talk about Simulacrum, because Simulacrum is a game breaking spell. All you DMs who think that Healing Spirit breaks the game, no. Simulacrum breaks the game. If you want to ban a spell, this is probably the spell you want to ban. So what it does is it creates a copy of a creature, and that creature can be yourself, though it doesn't have to be a friendly creature. Now it has a 10-minute casting time, so you would need to capture an enemy creature to duplicate them. But then it has all the abilities of the creature that you've duplicated. Now things like spells don't come back, and it has half the hit points. But it can concentrate on spells. It can cast your spell. So even if you use Simulacrum on yourself, it is insanely powerful. You double your action economy. Doubling the action economy of the wizard is a pretty big deal. Now the strategy of the wizard casting Simulacrum on themselves is something I hear about all the time, and I've talked about it before as well. One thing I don't hear talked about as much is using it on an enemy. It is not unreasonable to think we might capture enemies once in a while, and then we can cast Simulacrum on them. Consent is not required, and then we would get a copy of that enemy. Now if that enemy has something like, say, legendary actions, then the way I read it, the Simulacrum would have those legendary actions as well. So this is really appealing to me. So let me just give you an example of how that might work. So let's say the PCs are going up against the Warlord. This is a NPC from Volo's Guide to Monsters. And we defeat the Warlord, and then we knock it unconscious. Then we tie it all up, and then we cast Simulacrum on it. So then, in combat, that Warlord Simulacrum could hang back with the wizard, so it's not a primary target. So it would have not great hit points because it's half of its total, but Warlord normally has a lot of hit points, so it wouldn't be too bad. And then it has a ranged attack with a short bow that it could do on its round. But then every turn, it's getting 3 legendary actions. And it can use those actions to allow an ally to attack with advantage using its reaction. So that's basically 3 additional attacks from your allies every turn. So between the Warlord and then the 3 reaction attacks, we're essentially adding 5 additional attacks every round in combat for free. And it should be able to do this indefinitely. This doesn't use any resources. So really, we've just kind of broke D&D. Now it's worthy to note that at 14th level, illusionists get their ability Illusory Reality. And we've talked a lot about doing things that don't provide a saving throw. So here's another one. So now what an illusionist can do at this level is they can take a huge creature and they can surround it in an illusionary adamantium prison. Maybe with some arrow slits facing inwards. And then as their bonus action, they can make it real for a full minute. And now they no longer need to concentrate on it, and this creature is encased in adamantium, and we can just pepper it with arrows till it dies. No saving throw. You know what this uses? A 1st level spell. That's it. Silent image, and it's done. Now, if it's a gargantuan creature, we'd have to use a major image. So now we're using a 3rd level spell. So again, we can now do things like what we could do with Wall of Force, except we can basically do them in every battle because the resource cost is so much less. So what happens when we get to level 15 and 16? Well, the first thing that happens is encumbrance is a thing of the past. Because now with the spell Demiplane, we have a place we can keep our hordes of treasure. You just came across a dragon's treasure and there's no way you can carry it. No problem. We're going to create a demiplane. We're going to shove all that crap into the demiplane, and there it is. And then whenever we get back to our home base, we can cast demiplane again and access all of it. So encumbrance now, thing of the past. Another thing about demiplane is we can do it to store things like maybe there's nowhere safe for us to keep our mounts. So we're going to keep them there, and then we can access them later if we need to. We can also potentially use it for a safe place to rest. So Demiplane has all kinds of utility uses for us that change the way the game is played. Now we need to talk about the spell Maze. Maze is another way we can win a fight without providing an enemy a saving throw. And what happens is once we've sent the creature to another plane, then they make abilities checks to come back, and that ability check is an intelligence 20 check. It's not a saving throw. They still can't use their legendary resistances, and it means that something like a Tarrasque that you cast Maze on can't come back. You can keep it there for the entire duration of the spell, guaranteed. Now, unlike something like Force Cage, this is going to use your concentration, so that does bring the value down to some degree. On the other hand, you no longer have to anticipate against unexpected abilities, like maybe that creature having something like Disintegrate. So it is a little bit more reliable in that other sense. So there's some good and there's some bad there. Ultimately, we're going to probably take both spells, and now we just have one more tool we can use in combat. We have our 7th level slot, we have our 8th level slot, so that's 2 slots now. We can win a fight without a saving throw. Now I should also mention Clone. Now Clone requires a lot of downtime. If you don't have a lot of downtime, Clone's not a particularly useful spell. But some campaigns have years of downtime. And if you have a significant amount of downtime, then Clone can basically make your entire party immune to the TPK. Because if you give all your party members clones, then when they would have died, they simply wake up in the clone's body instead. Now, there's some downsides here to note. Number 1, you're outside of the combat. Number 2, you no longer have your equipment. So you're going to have to either try to recover it or give it up. Maybe you have backup equipment for your clones or something like that. One thing I've heard of, and I think is a decent idea, is your wizard's clone might be in a demiplane. Then the clone itself is super safe, and then it can cast demiplane to get out of the demiplane and get into the fight again right away. Either way, the ability to make your party immune to TPKs is pretty game-changing. So let's go ahead and talk about 17th level. So remember I was talking about blasts, and I was saying that about 9 points per level I consider reasonably good. That's what we would get from a Thunder Wave at 1st level. That's what we would get from a Fireball at 5th level. So a Meteor Swarm at 17th level, we're getting 15.5 points of damage per spell level. So we are basically almost doubling what I consider to be good damage for a blast. So that's insane amounts of damage for a blast. But let's add on top of it an insane range and an insane area. Now you should expect creatures hit with the Meteor Swarm to take 100 points of damage or more. So not only can we take out armies with this, but we can take out armies of tough creatures with this. So you've got an army of enemy dragons coming towards you. You can wipe them clean with a Meteor Swarm spell. But the spell, of course, we have to talk about at level 17 is Wish. And this is something I've heard about Wish recently.
In fact, unequivocally, it is simultaneously the best spell in Dungeons & Dragons and the most overrated spell in the game. It's Wish. It kind of functions like this emergency card that you can use to get whatever you needed in that moment. And in that way, what I've seen time and time again is players that are high-level characters that have this 9th level spell slot, they have Wish prepared, they end up leaving Wish uncast because they're waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it that never happens. And instead, they end up leaving it there, never using their 9th level spell, and they might as well multi-classed at 16th level and done something else because they never use their 9th level spell.
So what do we use our Wish on? Well, the obvious answers for me are Simulacrum and Resurrection. So if a party member goes down, you can bring them up with an action and no cost of resources. So if that happens, we're going to use our Wish every time. Now, what if we're not using it on a Resurrection and we're kind of saving it? Then we fight the big bad guy. What are we going to do? Simulacrum on the big bad guy right away. So now the big bad guy has to fight itself with us helping out the Simulacrum. So battle is essentially over. Now what happens if both those situations just don't occur, or they passed and we didn't need the Wish? Then what are we going to do with our Wish? Well, before we go for our long rest, we're going to use one action and we're going to cast Simulacrum. Maybe on ourselves, on a party member, or on a big bad guy if we've captured them. But on somebody. And this way, our Wish is never, ever wasted. There's no reason ever why a Wish should go uncast. I don't understand how wishes are going uncast. You're about to take a long rest. You still have your Wish. It's time to cast Wish. And there's something good you can cast it on. Wish is one of those spells. It should never have to go to waste. Ever. Meteor Swarm might. You might have Meteor Swarm, and you just never really get the chance to cast it. Maybe you're fighting a lot of single creatures, and doing an area of effect over a huge area just isn't really useful or reliable. But Wish is always going to be useful. If you don't cast it in combat, you're going to cast it out of combat. And if you cast it out of combat, you're at least going to cast it on that last round before you take a long rest. Then you're going to have it back the next day, and we're going to repeat. So now let's talk about 18th level, we're going to get Spell Mastery. That's going to give us a first level and a second level spell that we can cast without preparing it and without expending a spell slot. And we can do this over and over again. So what spells would I choose? Well, for first level, I think there's really two options. Absorb Elements or Shield, because these are spells you're going to cast over and over and over again, even at high levels. Now, I think Shield would be the obvious choice if we were lower level, but as we get to higher level, energy becomes a little more common, especially with things like powerful dragons. So I would probably be inclined towards the Absorb Elements, but I might go either way there. So what about the second level slot? What am I going to take? Probably Mirror Image. Again, because this is a spell I might just cast over and over and over again. Why not? And it only lasts a minute, so we need to use a lot of slots normally if we want to keep Mirror Images up, but we don't need to do that anymore. Now, why do I want Mirror Image even at high levels? Because it turns 3 hits into misses. And that's going to be useful no matter what level you are, because a third level wizard who turns a hit into a miss probably avoided 10 points of damage, and an 18th level who turned a hit into a miss probably avoided 50 points of damage. So it does scale with your level. Now I should mention, if I'm an illusionist, I'm probably taking Silent Image instead, just because I can use illusory reality with it. It's so worth it for me to be able to cast it an infinite amount of times. So basically what we're talking about here is we're finding spells that break the action economy, like Simulacrum. We're finding spells that break the mechanic concentration, like Force Cage and Mass Suggestion. We're finding spells that break the whole legendary resistance mechanic, like Force Cage. We're finding spells that break the casting time and material component mechanics, like Wish. We're finding more and more ways to layer defenses up and up and up, like Contingency. So one after another, we're breaking down all these mechanics in the game that are used to keep characters in check. And we can break them all because we are wizards. And that's the problem with super high level campaigns, is that if you don't have a wizard, you are going to feel not having a wizard. And if you have a wizard, things are going to be a lot easier than they otherwise would be. Because remember, when you have a wizard of a certain level, you actually kind of have 2 wizards, because you probably have a Simulacrum as well. So our lesson is, low level wizards, good in short spurts. Mid-level wizards, pretty good all the time. High level wizards can just break the game. And they are just dramatically better than any other class in the game at these levels. So what happens next? Well, next week we are going to start talking about wizard spells on a level by level basis. So next week we're going to be doing our level 1 spell evaluations for wizards. I'm going to talk about the great spells, the not so great spells, and kind of the order I would select them. I'm going to talk about which spells are really good just at low levels, which spells remain good at higher levels as well. Now, in these tactics videos, I've given you some ideas for spells, but those were really just one possibility. I'm going to give you lots of possibilities as we go through the level guides, because every 2 wizards shouldn't look the same. There's lots of good spells we can choose from, so that we have a little bit of versatility, and you can play wizards over and over again and do different things every time you play. So I hope you join me next week for our evaluation of first level wizard spells. Until then, I am going to sit back and I'm going to relax, and I'm going to have some fun, because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, guys. See you next week.